Welcome back to Part 2 of Chapter 3 from Rudolf Steiner's An Outline of Occult Science. Here, Steiner transitions from the mysteries of sleep to the profound realities of death, revealing how it liberates the ego from physical and etheric bonds, unveiling a panoramic memory of earthly life and the purifying, consuming fire of unfulfilled sensual desires. This section explores death not as an end, but as a gateway to spiritual revelation, where the astral body confronts its past and sheds earthly attachments. Prepare for insights into post-death experiences, memory tableaus, and the soul's emancipation, essential for understanding human evolution beyond the physical. Let's begin. Even death takes place for no other cause than a change in the connection of the principles of man's being. And what is visible to clairvoyant observation with regard to death may also be seen in its effects in the manifested world. In this case also, an unbiased judgment will find the teachings of occult science confirmed by observing external life. The expression of the invisible in the visible is, however, less evident with regard to these facts, and there is greater difficulty in feeling the full importance of that which in the events of outer life endorses the statements of occult science in this domain. These statements may be supposed to be mere pictures of fancy, even more readily than many other things that have been dealt with in this work, if we shut ourselves off from the knowledge that everywhere in the visible is contained an unmistakable foreshadowing of the invisible. On the approach of sleep, only the astral body is released from its connection with the etheric and physical bodies, which still remain united, whereas at death the separation of the physical from the etheric body takes place. The physical body is abandoned to its own forces and must therefore disintegrate as a corpse. At death, the etheric body finds itself in a condition in which it has never been before during the time between birth and death, with the exception of certain abnormal conditions to be dealt with later. That is to say, it is now united with the astral body in the absence of the physical body. For the etheric and astral bodies do not separate immediately after death. They are held together for a time by the agency of a force the presence of which can be easily understood. For were this force not present, the etheric body could not detach itself from the physical body. It would remain bound to the latter, as is shown in the case of sleep, when the astral body is not able to rend asunder these two principles of man's being. This force comes into action at death. It releases the etheric from the physical body, so that the former remains united to the astral body. Clairvoyant observation shows that this connection varies with different people after death. The time of its duration is measured by days. For the present, this period of time is mentioned only for the sake of information. Subsequently, the astral body is also released from the etheric body and goes on its way alone. During the union of the two bodies, the individual is in a state which enables him to be aware of the experiences of his astral body. As long as the physical body is there, the work of reinforcing the wasted organs has to be begun from without, as soon as the astral body is liberated from it. When once the physical body is separated, this work ceases. Nevertheless, the force which was expended in this way while the man was asleep continues after death and can now be applied to some other end. It is now used for making the astral body's own experiences perceptible. During his connection with his physical body, the outer world enters man's consciousness in images. After the body has been laid aside, that which is experienced by the astral body, when it is no longer connected with sense organs, with this outer physical world, becomes perceptible. At first, it has no new experiences. Its connection with the etheric body prevents it from experiencing anything new. What, however, it does possess is memory of its past life. The etheric body still being present causes that past life to appear as a vivid and comprehensive panorama. That is man's first experience after death. He sees his life from birth to death spread out before him in a series of pictures. Memory is only present in the waking state, when during life man is united with his physical body, and it is present only to the extent allowed by that body. Nothing is lost to the soul that has made an impression on it during life. Were the physical body a perfect instrument for the purpose, it would be possible at any moment during life to conjure up the whole of the past before the eyes of the soul. At death, there is no longer any obstacle to this. As long as the etheric body remains, there exists a certain degree of perfection of memory. But this disappears according to the degree in which the etheric body loses the form which it possessed while united with the physical body, and which resembles that body. This is the very reason why the astral body separates after a time from the etheric body. It can remain united with the latter only so long as the form of the etheric body corresponds with that of the physical body. During the period of life between birth and death, separation of the etheric body occurs only in exceptional cases, and for no longer than a brief space of time. If, for example, a man exposes one of his limbs to pressure, part of his etheric body may become separated from the physical one. We say on such occasion that the limb has gone to sleep, and the peculiar sensation we feel results from the separation of the etheric body. Of course, a materialistic manner of explanation may here again deny the invisible behind the visible and say, all this arises merely from the physical disturbance caused by the pressure. Clairvoyant vision can see in such a case how the corresponding part of the etheric body extends beyond the physical limb. Now, if a man experiences an unusual shock or something similar, such a separation of the etheric body from a large part of the physical body may result for a short time. That is the case when a man, for some reason or other, is suddenly brought face to face with death, for example, when drowning or threatened by a fatal accident when mountaineering. What is related by people who have had such experiences comes, in fact, very near the truth and can be ratified by clairvoyant observation. They declare that in such moments their whole lives pass before their minds as though in a huge memory picture. Out of the many examples which might here be adduced, allusion will be made to only one, because it originates from a man whose mode of thought would make everything said here about such things seem pure fancy. Moritz Benedict, the distinguished criminal anthropologist and eminent investigator in many other realms of natural science, relates in his Reminiscences an experience of his own, to the effect that once, when on the point of drowning in a bath, he had seen his whole life pass before his memory as though in a single picture. If other people describe differently the pictures seen by them under similar circumstances, and even in such a way that they seem to have little to do with the events of their past life, that does not contradict what has been said. For the pictures which arise in the quiet abnormal condition during the separation from the physical body are sometimes at first sight unintelligible in their relation to life. Correct observation, however, would always recognize this relationship. Neither is it an objection if, for example, someone who was once on the point of drowning did not experience what has been described. For it must be borne in mind that this can happen only when the etheric body is really separated from the physical body, when, moreover, the former is still united with the astral body. If, through the fright, a loosening of the etheric and astral bodies also takes place, the experience is not forthcoming, because then complete unconsciousness ensues, as in dreamless sleep. Immediately after death, the events of the past appear as though compressed by the memory into a picture. After its separation from the etheric body, the astral body pursues its further wanderings alone. It is not difficult to realize that everything continues to exist which, by means of its activity, the astral body has made its own during its sojourn in the physical body. The ego has to a certain extent elaborated the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit man. As far as these are developed, they do not owe their existence to the organs present in the different bodies, but to the ego. And it is precisely this ego which needs no outer organs for perception. Nor does it require any such organs in order to retain possession of what it has made one with itself. It might be objected, why then is there no perception during sleep of the developed spirit self, life spirit, and spirit man? For this reason, that the ego is chained to the physical body between birth and death. Even though, during sleep, it is out of the physical body with the astral body, it nevertheless remains closely connected with the physical body. For the activity of the astral body is directed toward the physical body. On this account, the ego is relegated to the outer world of sense for its observations, and cannot receive spiritual revelations in their direct form. Not until death do these revelations come within reach of the ego, because by means of death, the ego is freed from its connection with the physical and etheric bodies. Another world may flash upon the consciousness the moment it is withdrawn from the physical world which during life monopolizes its activity. Now, there are reasons why even at this juncture, all connection with the outer physical world of sense does not cease for man. That is to say, certain desires remain which sustain the connection. There are desires which man creates just because he is conscious of his ego as the fourth principle of his being. These desires and wishes, springing from the existence of his three lower bodies, can operate only in the external world, and cease to operate when these bodies are cast aside. Hunger is caused by the external body. As soon as that external body is no longer connected with the ego, hunger ceases. Now, had the ego no further desires than those springing from its own spiritual nature, it might at death draw full satisfaction from the spiritual world into which it is transplanted. But life has given it other desires as well. It has kindled in it a longing for pleasures only to be enjoyed by means of physical organs, although these pleasures themselves do not originate in the nature of those organs. It is not only the three bodies which demand gratification from the spiritual world, but the ego itself finds pleasures in that world, for the enjoyment of which there exist no means whatever in the spiritual world. During life, the ego has two kinds of desires: those that spring from the bodies and must therefore be gratified within the bodies, but which must also come to an end with their disintegration, and those that arise from the spiritual nature of the ego. As long as the ego lives in the bodies, those cravings are satisfied by means of the bodily organs. For in the manifestations of the bodily organs, the hidden spiritual element is at work, and the senses receive something spiritual as well, in everything of which they are cognizant. That spiritual element is also present after death, although in a different form. Everything spiritual that the ego longs for while in the world of sense, it still possesses when the senses are no longer there. Now, if a third kind of wish were not added to these two, death would mean only a transition from desires which may be satisfied through the senses to such as are fulfilled by the revelation of the spiritual world. The third kind of desire is that which is created by the ego during life in the sense world, because it finds pleasure in that world, even when no spiritual element is revealed in it. The humblest pleasures may be manifestations of the spirit. The satisfaction afforded a starving creature by taking food is a manifestation of the spirit, for by taking food, something is thereupon brought about which, in a certain sense, the spiritual nature could not develop. But the ego can go beyond the pleasure, which in this case is the outcome of necessity. It may even long for the delicious food quite apart from the service rendered to the spirit by taking nourishment. It is the same with other things in the sense world. Desires are created in this way which would never have appeared in the sense world if the human ego had not been incorporated in it. Neither do such desires arise from the spiritual nature of the ego. The ego must have pleasures of the senses as long as it lives in the body, even though it be for the very reason that its own nature is spiritual. For the spirit manifests in material things, and the ego is enjoying nothing less than spirit when it surrenders itself to that element in the sense world which is irradiated by the light of the spirit. Moreover, it will continue to enjoy this light even when the senses are no longer the medium through which the spiritual rays pass. But there is no fulfillment possible in the spiritual world for desires in which the spirit is not living even in the world of the senses. When death takes place, the possibility of gratifying desires of this description is cut off. Pleasure in good things to eat can be induced only by the presence of the physical organs required for their consumption, the palate, tongue, and so forth. But when man has laid aside his physical body, he no longer possesses these organs. If, however, the ego still craves that kind of pleasure, the craving must remain unsatisfied. As long as this pleasure corresponds to the spiritual need, it is caused only by the presence of the physical organs. But should it happen that the ego has created the desire without serving the spirit in so doing, it retains it after death in the form of a craving which thirsts in vain for gratification. We can form an idea of what man then experiences only by imagining someone suffering from burning thirst in a region where, far and wide, there is no water to be found. This is the predicament of the ego after death, as long as it retains ungratified desires for the pleasures of the outer world, and has no organs by means of which to satisfy them. Of course, the burning thirst, serving as a comparison for the condition of the ego after death, must be thought of as enormously increased, and it must be imagined as extending to all desires still existing, for which all possibility of gratification is lacking. The next condition of the ego consists in freeing itself from this bond of attraction to the outer world. With regard to this world, it has to attain purification and liberation. It must be cleansed of all wishes which it has created while in the body, and which have no native rights in the spiritual world. As an object is caught and burned up by fire, so is the world of desire, described above, broken up and destroyed after death. A vista is then opened into that world which occult science calls the consuming fire of the spirit. This fire seizes upon desires of a sensual nature which, however, are not rooted in the spirit. Revelations of this kind which occult science is bound to make with regard to such events may appear hopeless and terrible. It may seem a fearful thing that a hope for the realization of which sense organs are required should after death be transformed into despair, and that a wish that can be fulfilled only by the physical world should be changed into torturing deprivation. Yet we can hold such an opinion only as long as we fail to realize that the wishes and desires seized by the consuming fire after death do not, in a higher sense, represent forces beneficial to life, but destructive to it. By means of these forces, the ego binds itself to the sense world more closely than is necessary, in order to draw from it all the experience it requires. For the sense world is a manifestation of the hidden and spiritual world which lies behind it. And the ego could never attain spiritual happiness through the bodily senses, which are the only form in which the spiritual can be manifested, unless it utilized the senses to seek the spiritual element in sense experience. Nevertheless, the ego loses sight of the true spiritual reality in the physical world to such an extent that it experiences sensual desires irrespective of the needs of the spirit. If sense pleasure, as the expression of the spirit, serves to raise and develop the ego, any pleasure which is not an expression of the spirit warps and impoverishes it. Even though such a desire finds the means of its gratification in the sense world, still its destructive effect upon the ego is thereby in no way diminished. But it is not until after death that its disastrous effects become apparent. For this reason, a man may, by gratifying such desires, create, during his life, new and similar desires, wholly unaware that he is enveloping himself in a quote-unquote consuming fire. What becomes visible to him after death is only what already surrounded him during his life, and by thus becoming visible, it at once appears in its salutary and beneficent effect. A human being who loves another is certainly not attracted merely by that part of him which is perceptible to the physical senses, the only part which is cut off from observation after death. But after death, just that part of the dear one then becomes visible for the perception of which the physical organs were only the means. The one thing, in fact, which would prevent a man from beholding his friend clearly is the presence of desires which can be satisfied only by means of physical organs. Unless these desires are extinguished, he can have no conscious perception of his friend after death. When looked at in this light, the terrible and hopeless character which after-death experiences might assume for man, according to the descriptions given by occult science, becomes changed into one which is thoroughly satisfying and consoling. Now, the first after-death experiences differ entirely in yet another respect from those during life. During the time of purification, man lives, as it were, backwards. He lives over again the whole span of his life since birth, beginning with the events immediately preceding his death and reversing the order of his experiences. He goes through them again until he reaches back to childhood. In this process, he sees with spiritually enlightened eyes all those things which were not inspired by the spiritual nature of the ego, with the difference that he now experiences these things in reverse order. For instance, a man who died in his 60th year, and who at the age of 40 had, in an outburst of anger, caused someone either physical or mental pain, will go through this experience again when, on the return journey of existence after death, he reaches that point in his 40th year. But now he does not experience the satisfaction which his attack had afforded him during life. Instead, he experiences the pain which he inflicted upon the other man. It may at once be seen, however, that whatever pain he feels in the after-death experience is caused by a desire of the ego arising only from the outer physical world. In reality, the ego does not only injure another by the indulgence of such a desire, but it also injures itself, although the injury to itself is not apparent during life. After death, however, the whole of the harmful world of desires becomes visible to the ego, which then feels attracted toward every being or object which had kindled the desire, in order that this may be destroyed in the consuming fire by the same means that created it. When man, on his return journey, reaches the moment of his birth, then only have all such desires been purged in the purifying flames, and henceforth nothing remains to hinder him from devoting himself entirely to the spiritual world. He enters upon a new phase of existence. In the same way that he laid aside his physical body at death, and soon afterward his etheric body, so does that part of his astral body dissolve which can only live in the consciousness of the outer physical world. Occult science, therefore, recognizes three corpses: the physical, etheric, and astral. The period at which the last is cast off by man is marked by the time of purification, which amounts to about 1/3 of the time elapsed between birth and death. The reason why this is so can only be explained later, when the course of human life is examined from the standpoint of occult science. To clairvoyant observation, astral corpses, which have been cast off by human beings passing from the state of purification into a higher existence, are constantly visible in the world surrounding man in exactly the same way that physical corpses in places inhabited by men are apparent to physical observation. After purification, an entirely new state of consciousness begins for the ego. Whereas before death, the outer perceptions must flow to the ego, in order that upon these perceptions the light of consciousness might be able to fall, so now in like manner from within streams a world which attains consciousness. The ego is living in this world also between birth and death. Only then this world is clothed in the manifestations of the senses. It is only when the ego, freed from all the ties of sense, turns inward to behold its own holy of holies, that its true innermost nature, which had hitherto been obscured by the senses, is revealed to it. In the same way that the ego is recognized inwardly before death, so, after death and purification, is the spiritual life inwardly revealed to it in all its fullness. This revelation really takes place immediately after the etheric body is laid aside, but it is obscured by the dark cloud of desires turned toward the outer world. It is as though a world of spiritual bliss were invaded by black demoniacal phantoms caused by those desires which are being destroyed by the consuming fire. Indeed, these desires are not mere phantoms, but real entities, which become apparent immediately after the ego is deprived of physical organs, and is thus able to discern those things which are of a spiritual nature. These entities have the appearance of distorted caricatures of the objects with which the individual had formerly become acquainted through his senses. Clairvoyant observation shows that this place of purging fire is peopled by beings whose appearance may well seem horrifying and painful to spiritual vision, whose pleasure seems to consist in destruction, and whose passions impel them to evil-doing of such a description that the evil of the physical world seems insignificant in comparison. Whatever desires of the kind described above are brought into that world by man are looked upon by these beings as food, by means of which their powers are continually strengthened and invigorated. The picture thus sketched of a world imperceptible to the senses may seem less incredible if we look with an unprejudiced eye on part of the animal world. What is a fierce, devouring wolf from a spiritual point of view? What does it reveal to us through that which our senses perceive? Nothing else than a soul that lives in desires and acts by desire. The external form of the wolf may be called an embodiment of those desires. And if man had no organs with which to perceive that form, if its desires appeared invisibly in their effects, if, therefore, a force invisible to the eye were prowling about and might be the cause of all that happened through the visible wolf, he would still be forced to recognize the existence of a creature corresponding to it. Now, the beings of the region of purifying fire are not visible to the physical eye, but to clairvoyant sight only. But their effects are clearly apparent. They bring about the destruction of the ego when it gives them nourishment. These effects are clearly visible if what began as a pleasure leads to excess and debauchery. For even what is perceptible to the senses would attract the ego only insofar as the pleasure had its root in the ego's own nature. The animal is prompted by desire for that in the outer world which its three bodies crave. Man has higher enjoyments because to the three principles of his bodily nature is added the fourth, the ego. But if the ego seeks a gratification which does not tend toward the maintenance and development of its nature, but to its destruction, then such a craving can be neither the effect of its three bodies, nor that of its own nature, but can only be caused by beings concealed from the senses in their true form, but able furtively to approach that higher nature of the ego and excite in it desires which, though it is cut off from the senses, can still be satisfied only by means of sense organs. For there are beings which feed on passions and desires of a worse kind than those of an animal nature, because they do not expend themselves on objects of the senses, but seize upon the spiritual element and drag it down to a sensual level. Therefore, the forms of such beings are more hideous, more horrible to spiritual sight than are the forms of the fiercest animals, in which, after all, only passions rooted in the senses are incarnated. And the destructive forces of these beings immeasurably surpass any destructive rage existing in the animal world as perceived by the senses. Occult science must in this way enlarge man's view so as to include a world of beings standing, in a certain respect, lower than the visibly destructive animal world. When man has passed through the world of purification after death, he finds himself in a world the contents of which are spiritual, and which also creates in him longings which can be satisfied only by spiritual things. But even now, man distinguishes between that which properly belongs to his ego and what forms the environment of that ego. One might say its spiritual outer world. Only that of which he becomes sensible in this environment pours in upon him in the same way that the perception of his own ego poured in upon him during his sojourn in the body. Whereas man's environment in the life between birth and death speaks to him through his bodily organs, after death, when all the bodies are laid aside, the language of his new environment penetrates directly into the innermost sanctuary of the ego. Man's whole environment is now filled with beings of a like nature with his ego, for only an ego has access to an ego. Just as minerals, plants, and animals surround man in the sense world and compose it, so, after death, is he surrounded by a world composed of beings of a spiritual nature. Yet he takes something with him into this world which is not part of his environment there. It is what the ego has experienced in the world of the senses. First of all, the sum of these experiences appeared as a comprehensive memory picture immediately after death, while the etheric body was still united to the ego. The etheric body itself is then, indeed, laid aside, but something of the memory picture remains with the ego as an everlasting possession. Just as though an extract or essence were made out of all the events and experiences which a man encounters between birth and death, so might we describe that which is left behind. It is the spiritual product of life, its fruit. This product is of a spiritual nature. It contains everything spiritual which is revealed through the senses, yet this spiritual treasure could not have been gathered save by life in the sense world. This spiritual fruit of the sense world becomes after death the ego's own inner world. With it, the ego enters a world which consists of beings who reveal themselves in the same and only manner in which man, in his innermost depths, can become conscious of his own ego. As a plant seed, which is the essence of the whole plant, grows only when buried in another world, the earth, so now that which the ego brings from the sense world gradually unfolds itself as a seed under the influence of the spiritual environment in which it has been planted. Occult science can, of course, only portray in pictures what happens in this spirit world. Still, those pictures present themselves as absolute reality to the clairvoyant's sight when he investigates invisible happenings corresponding to those which are visible to the physical eye. Whatever of that world can be described may be visualized by comparison with the world of the senses, for although it is of a purely spiritual nature, it nevertheless resembles the physical world in certain respects. Just as, for instance, in the physical world, a color appears when some object impresses the eye, so in the spiritual world a color appears to the ego when a being acts upon it. But this latter phenomenon is perceived in the same manner as the ego can be perceived inwardly between birth and death. It is not as though the light outside fell within upon the man, but as though another being directly affected the ego, causing the latter to picture this influence in a color form. Thus do all things in the spiritual environment of the ego find expression in a world of colored rays. As their origin is of a different kind, it goes without saying that these colors of the spiritual world are also of a somewhat different character from physical colors. A similar thing is true of other impressions received by man in the world of sense. But it is the sounds of the spiritual world that most nearly resemble the impressions of the sense world. And the more at home a man becomes in the spiritual world, the more he realizes it as a life of self-determined motion, which may be compared with the sounds and the harmony of sounds of the physical world. Only he does not feel the tones as something approaching an organ from outside, but as a force streaming forth into the outer world through his ego. He feels the sound just as in the sense world he feels his own speech or song, only he knows that in the spiritual world these sounds, streaming out from him, are at the same time the manifestations of other beings, who are pouring themselves into the world through him. A still higher manifestation takes place in the spirit land when the sound becomes the spiritual word. Then there streams through the ego not only the pulsing life of another spiritual being, but such a being itself communicates its own inner nature to the ego. And then, when the spiritual word streams through the ego, two beings live in one another, without that separating element which every companionship in the sense world must carry with it. And this is really the nature of the communion of the ego with other spiritual beings after death. There are three regions in the spiritual world which may be compared to the three divisions of the physical sense world. The first region is in a certain respect the solid land of the spiritual world, the second the sphere of ocean and river, and the third the atmospheric region. That which assumes physical form on earth so that it can be perceived by physical organs in accordance with its spiritual nature, is to be seen in the first region of the spirit world. There, for instance, may be seen the force that fashions the form of a crystal. Only what is there revealed is the opposite of that which appears in the sense world. In that world, the space which is filled by a mass of rock appears to spiritual sight as a kind of hollow space. But round about this hollow is seen the force which fashions the form of the rock. The color of the rock in the sense world appears in the spiritual world as its complementary color. Thus, a red stone is green when seen from the spirit world, a green stone is red, and so on. Other qualities also appear in their opposites. Just as stone, masses of earth, and like materials make up the solid land, the continental region of the world of sense, so do the structures described above compose the solid land of the spiritual world. All that is life in the sense world belongs to the ocean region of the spiritual world. To the physical eye, life appears in its effects in plants, animals, and men. To spiritual vision, life is a flowing substance, like oceans and rivers, diffused through the spirit world. A still better comparison is that of the circulation of the blood in the body. For whereas seas and rivers are seen to be irregularly distributed in the physical world, a certain regularity in distribution of the flowing life reigns in the spirit world, as in the circulation of the blood. This flowing life is simultaneously heard as spiritual sound. The third region of the spiritual world is its atmosphere. What is known in the physical world as feeling is also present there, permeating everything like the air on earth. We must imagine a rushing sea of feeling. Pain and sorrow, joy and rapture flow through this region like wind and storms in the atmosphere of the physical world. Imagine a battle fought on earth. There confront one another not merely human forms, as seen by the physical eye, but feelings opposed to feelings, passions to passions. Pain fills the battlefield just as much as do the forms of men. All that is seething there of passion, pain, and the joy of victory is not only perceptible in its effects as revealed to the physical senses. It may be seen with the spiritual senses as an atmospheric process in the spirit world. Such an event in the spiritual world is like a thunderstorm in the physical, and the perception of these events may be compared to the hearing of words in the physical world. For this reason, it is said that as the air envelops and permeates earthly things, so do interweaving spiritual words pervade the beings and events of the spirit world. And still further observations are possible in this spirit world. What may be compared to light and heat in the physical world is there too. That which permeates everything in the spirit world, as earthly things and beings are permeated by heat, is the world of thought itself. There, however, thoughts must be regarded as living and independent beings. What is understood by man in the manifested world as thought is but a shadow of what lives as a thought being in the spirit world. Imagine thought, as it now exists in man, raised out of him and as an active, energetic being, endowed with an inner life of its own, and you have a feeble illustration of that which fills the fourth region of the spirit world. In the physical world between birth and death, what man understands as thought is but the manifestation of the thought world as it is able to mold itself by means of the instruments afforded by the bodies. All such thoughts cherished by man that carry with them an enrichment of the physical world have their origin in this region. By such thoughts are meant not only the ideas of great inventors and men of genius, but those ideas found in every individual which he does not owe solely to the external world, but through which he, so to speak, transforms that world. Insofar as feelings and passions are concerned, the cause of which lies in the outer world, these feelings are perceptible in the third region of the spirit world. But everything which so lives in a man's soul as to make him a creator, influencing, transforming, and fertilizing his environment, is manifest in its original and intrinsic form in the fourth division of the spirit world. That which exists in the fifth region may be compared to physical light. In its archetypal form, it is wisdom in manifestation. Beings who diffuse wisdom throughout their surroundings, as the sun pours light on physical beings, belong to this realm. Whatever is illuminated by their wisdom stands forth in its true meaning and significance for the spiritual world, just as the color of a physical object is seen when the light falls upon it. There are still higher regions of the spirit world, which will be described later in this work. Into this world, the ego is plunged after death, together with the results it carries with it out of physical life. And these results are still united with that part of the astral body which is not cast off at the end of the time of purification. In fact, only that part falls away which, in its desires and wishes, turned after death toward physical life. The plunging of the ego into the spiritual world, with what it has acquired in the physical world, may be compared to the planting of a grain of seed in the soil in which it can mature. As the grain of seed draws substances and forces from its surroundings in order that it may develop into a new plant, so the condition of the ego, when implanted in the spiritual world, is one of development and growth. Hidden within that which is perceived by an organ, there lies the force whereby that same organ was formed. The eye perceives light, but without light there would be no eye. Creatures spending their lives in darkness do not develop organs of sight. Thus, the whole of man's physical body is created out of the hidden forces of that of which he becomes conscious through his bodily organs. The physical body is built up by the forces of the physical world, the etheric body by those of the life world, and the astral body is formed out of the astral world. Now, when the ego is transferred to the spirit world, it is met by just those forces which remain hidden to physical perception. What appear to man's view in the first region of the spirit world are the spiritual beings that are always surrounding him and that have built up his physical body. Thus, in the physical world, man perceives nothing but the manifestations of those spiritual forces which have formed his own physical body. After death, he is in the very midst of these molding forces, which, previously hidden, now appear to him in their true forms. In the same way, in the second region, he is in the midst of the forces by which his etheric body was organized, and in the third region there pour in upon him the potencies out of which his astral body was formed. The higher regions of the spirit world also direct toward him those forces from which he was built in the life between birth and death. These denizens of the spiritual world are at present working in cooperation with that which man has brought with him as the product of his last life, which now becomes a germ. And through this cooperation, man is, first of all, built up anew as a spiritual being. The physical and etheric bodies are still joined in sleep. The astral body and the ego are, it is true, outside them, but still connected with them. Whatever influences the astral body and the ego receive in such a state from the spiritual world can serve only to recuperate the forces exhausted during the waking state. But when the physical and etheric bodies have been laid aside, and, after the time of purification, also those parts of the astral body still bound by their desires to the physical world, then everything pouring in upon the ego from the spiritual world is not only a reforming but a reorganizing force. After a certain period, to be dealt with in later chapters, the ego again gathers round it an astral body which will be able to live in such an etheric and physical body as man possesses between birth and death. A man can once more pass through birth and renew his earthly existence, in which, however, will be incorporated the results of his former life. Until the rebuilding of his astral body, man is a witness of his reconstruction. As the powers of the spirit world are not manifested to him through external organs, but from within outward, like his own ego and self-consciousness, he is able to observe that manifestation as long as his attention is not turned to an outer world of perception. But from the moment that the astral body is reconstituted, his attention is turned outward. The astral body once more craves an outer etheric and physical body. It is thus turned away from the inner revelations. For this reason, there is now an intermediate state, during which man is immersed in unconsciousness. Consciousness can emerge again in the physical world only when the necessary organs for physical perception are formed. During this period, in which consciousness illuminated by inner perception ceases, the new etheric body begins to link itself to the astral, and man can once again enter a physical body. In the linking together of these two bodies, only such an ego could consciously take part as had of itself created the life spirit and the spirit man out of the creative forces hidden in the etheric and physical bodies. Until the individual has evolved as far as this, beings further advanced than himself in evolution must guide this linking together. The astral body is guided by such beings as these to parents through whom it may be endowed with the appropriate etheric and physical bodies. Before the attachment of the etheric body takes place, something of very great importance happens to the man who is about to re-enter physical existence. In his former life, he created disturbing forces, which were revealed to him on the journey retraced after death. Let us again take an example. He caused some pain in an outburst of anger in the 40th year of his former life. After death, the other's pain came before him as a force which had interfered with the evolution of his ego. It is likewise with all such events of his former life. On his re-entrance into physical life, these hindrances to his evolution confront the ego anew. As, on the threshold of death, a sort of memory picture arose before the human ego, so there now arises a vision of the life approaching. Again, he sees a picture, this time showing all the obstacles which he has to clear away if he is to advance in evolution. And what he thus sees becomes the starting point for forces which he must bring with him into his new life. The picture of the pain he has caused the other man becomes a force which impels the ego, on entering life again, to make amends for this pain. Thus, the previous life has a determining effect on the new one. The deeds of the new life are in a certain way caused by those of the former life. This connection, following the law, between an earlier and later existence is to be looked upon as the law of destiny. It has become usual to designate it karma, a term borrowed from Oriental wisdom. The building up of a new set of bodies, however, is not the only task incumbent upon man between death and a new birth. While this building up is taking place, man lives outside the physical world. That world, however, continues to evolve during this time. The surface of the earth changes in comparatively short periods of time. What aspect did those regions which are now occupied by Germany bear a few thousand years ago? When man appears on earth in a new existence, the earth rarely looks the same as it did at the time of his last incarnation. During his absence from the earth, all sorts of changes have occurred. Now, hidden forces are also at work in this alteration of the face of the earth, proceeding from that very world in which man finds himself after death. And he himself must cooperate with these forces in the transformation of the earth. He can do so only under the direction of higher beings until, by the creation of his life spirit and spirit man, he has acquired a clear perception of the connection between the spiritual and its expression in the physical. But he takes part in the transformation of earthly conditions. It may be said that during the period between death and a new birth, man so transforms the earth that its conditions are in keeping with what he has evolved in himself. If we look at a given place on the earth at a definite moment, and see it again after a long lapse of time, under entirely changed conditions, the forces which have wrought the change have proceeded from those who are now dead. And it is this kind of connection which exists between them and the earth until the time of rebirth. Clairvoyant observation sees in all physical existence the manifestation of a hidden spiritual element. To physical observation, it is the light of the sun, climatic changes, and so on, that affect the transformation of the earth. But to clairvoyance, it is the force of the dead that acts in the rays of light which fall on the plant from the sun. The clairvoyant sees how human souls hover about plants, how they change the surface of the earth. Not alone upon himself, nor upon the preparations for his own new earthly existence, is man's attention bestowed after death. No, he is called upon then to work upon the outer world, just as he is in life between the time of his birth and death. Not only does the life of man affect the conditions of the physical world from the spirit land, but vice versa, activity during physical existence has its effects in the spiritual world. An example may explain what happens in this respect. A bond of love exists between mother and child. This love arises from a mutual attraction caused by the forces of the sense world. But in the course of time, it changes. A spiritual tie gradually grows out of the sense bond, and this spiritual tie is not created for the physical world only, but for the spirit world as well. The same applies to other ties. Whatever is created in the physical world by spiritual entities continues to exist in the spiritual world. Friends who were closely united in life belong to each other in spirit land also, and when their bodies are laid aside, they are in much more intimate communion than during physical life. For as spirits, they exist for each other in the same way as, in the above description, spiritual beings reveal themselves to others by inner manifestation. And a tie created between two persons brings them together again in a new life. Thus, in the truest sense of the word, we may speak of finding one another again after death. What has once happened to a man between birth and death, and from then till a new birth, repeats itself. Man returns to earth again and again when the fruit he has earned in a physical life has ripened in the spirit world. It is not, however, a case of repetition without beginning or end. But man has emerged out of other forms of existence and passed into those which run their course in the manner just described, and he will again in the future pass into other forms. A viewpoint of these transition stages will be gained when the evolution of the universe in connection with man is subsequently considered from the standpoint of occult science. The occurrences between death and a new birth are, of course, still more concealed from outer sense observation than is the spiritual foundation underlying manifested life between birth and death. This sense observation can see only the effects of that portion of the hidden world where they impinge upon physical existence. With regard to this, the question must arise whether man, on entering this life at birth, brings with him any results from the events described by occult science as having taken place between his last death and rebirth. If one finds the shell of a snail in which there is no trace of the animal, he will, in spite of that, recognize that this snail shell was formed by the activity of an animal, and he cannot believe that the shell constructed a form for itself by means of mere physical forces. In the same way, one who studies a man during life and finds something in him which cannot be due to this life might reasonably admit that it arises from what occult science describes if by doing so an explanatory light is thrown on what is otherwise inexplicable. Here, too, the unseen causes might appear intelligible to rational sense observation from their visible effects, and whoever observes life with absolute impartiality will find that, with every fresh observation, this appears to be more and more true. The important question, however, is how to find the right point of view from which to observe their effects in life. Where, for example, are the effects of that to be found which occult science describes as incidents of the time of purification? How are the effects of the experience which, according to occult investigations, man undergoes in purely spiritual regions, manifested after this time of purification? Problems enough press upon every serious and profound student of life in this domain. We see one man born in want and misery, endowed only with inferior abilities, so that on account of these facts, which are incident to his birth, he appears predestined to a miserable experience. Another, from the first moment of his life, is tended and cherished by loving hands and hearts. Brilliant talents are unfolded in him. His gifts point to a successful and satisfactory career. Two opposite views may be taken when met by such questions as these. The one will adhere to what the senses perceive and what the understanding, relying on these senses, is able to comprehend. This view will admit no problem in the fact that one man is born fortunate and the other unfortunate. Even if the word chance is not used, there will be no question of thinking that such things are brought about through any law of cause and effect. And with regard to talents and abilities, such a view will consider them as inherited from parents, grandparents, and other ancestors. It refuses to seek the causes in spiritual events which the man himself met with before birth, regardless of heredity, and by means of which he shaped his talents and abilities. Another view would find no satisfaction in such an interpretation. It would assert that even in the manifested world, nothing happens in definite places or surroundings without our having to presuppose causes for the event in question. Even though in many cases such causes have not yet been investigated, they are there. An alpine flower does not grow in the lowlands. Its nature has something which associates it with alpine regions. Just so must there be something in a man which determines his birth in a certain environment. Causes belonging to the physical world alone are not sufficient to account for this. To a more profound thinker, such an explanation appears in somewhat the same light as when one has dealt another blow, the motive for which is not attributed to the feelings of the one, but is to be explained by the physical mechanism of the hand. Any explanation of abilities and talents solely by heredity is to such a viewpoint equally unsatisfactory. It is true, one may say, see how certain talents are inherited in families. During 2.5 centuries, musical talents were inherited by members of the Bach family. 8 mathematicians sprang from the Bernoulli family, to some of whom quite different occupations were assigned in their childhood. But the inherited talents always drove them to the family vocation. It may be further pointed out how, by an exact investigation of the line of ancestry of a person in one way or another, the gifts of this person have shown themselves in the forefathers and only represent the sum of inherited talents. Whoever holds the latter of the two views above indicated will be sure not to let such facts pass unnoticed, but to him they cannot mean the same as they do to one who relies for his interpretation on the events of the world of sense alone. The former will point out that inherited talents can no more of themselves combine into a complete personality than can the metal parts of a watch fit themselves together. And if objection is made that the cooperation of the parents may possibly produce the combination of talents, that this, as it were, takes the place of the watchmaker, he will reply, "Look impartially at what is new in every child personality, at that which is absolutely new. That cannot come from the parents, for the simple reason that it does not exist in them." Inaccurate thinking may create much confusion in this domain. It is still worse when those who hold the second view are set down by the supporters of the first as opponents of what is, after all, borne out by ascertained facts. But it may well be that the latter have not the slightest intention of denying the truth or value of those facts. For instance, they see that a definite mental aptitude or predisposition is inherited in a family, and that certain gifts accumulated and combined in one descendant result in a remarkable personality. They are perfectly willing to acquiesce when it is said that the most celebrated name seldom stands at the beginning but at the end of a line of descent. But it should not be taken amiss if they are compelled to form very different opinions on the subject from those of people who are determined to accept nothing but material evidence. To the latter, it may be said that it is true a man shows the characteristics of his ancestors, because the spirit soul, which enters upon physical existence at birth, draws its bodily substance from that which heredity bestows on it. But this says nothing more than that a being shows the peculiarities of the body into which it has descended. It is no doubt a singular, a trivial comparison, but the unprejudiced person will not deny its justification when one says that a human being who shows the qualities of his forefathers proves the origin of the personal qualities of that human being as little as the fact that man is wet because he has fallen into the water proves something regarding his inner nature. And it may further be said that if the most celebrated name stands at the end of a line of a family descent, it shows that the bearer of that name needed that particular ancestry to build the body necessary for the expression of his whole personality. But it is no proof that his actual personal qualities were transmitted to him. Such a statement is, on the contrary, opposed to sound logic. If personal gifts were inherited, they would be found at the beginning of a line of descent, and starting from that point be transmitted to the descendants. As, however, they stand at the end, it is evident that they are not transmitted. Now, it is not to be denied that those who speak of a spiritual causality in life have contributed no less to bringing about confusion of thought. Far too much generalizing and vague discussion comes from this quarter. To say that a man's personality is a combination of inherited characteristics may certainly be compared with the assertion that the metal parts of a watch have fitted themselves together. It must also be admitted that, with regard to many assertions about a spiritual world, it is as though someone said that the metal parts of a watch cannot put themselves together in such a way as to enable the hands to move forward. Some intelligence must therefore be present to effect this forward movement. In face of such an assertion, he certainly builds on a far better foundation who says, "Oh, I care nothing for your mystical beings who move the hands forward. What I want to know is the mechanical construction by means of which the forward movement of the hands is achieved." It is by no means a question of merely knowing that behind a mechanism, a watch for instance, there is an intelligence, the watchmaker. It can only be of importance to know the ideas in the watchmaker's mind which preceded the construction of the watch. these thoughts may be rediscovered in the mechanism. Mere dreaming and imagining about the supersensual only result in confusion, for they are not calculated to satisfy opponents. The latter are right in saying that such general allusions to superphysical beings are not at all conducive to an understanding of facts. Of course, such opponents might also say the same of the exact statements of occult science. But in that case, it may be pointed out that the effects of hidden spiritual causes are seen in manifested life. Let us assume for the moment that what occult science asserts, proven by observation, is correct. That a man has gone through a time of purification after death, and that during this period he has experienced in his soul how a certain deed, performed by him in a former life, was a hindrance to his progressive evolution. While he was undergoing this experience, the impulse arose in him to make amends for that deed. He brings this impulse with him into a new life, and its presence produces a tendency in his nature which draws him into conditions rendering the amendment possible. Taking into consideration a number of such impulses, we have the cause for a man's being born into an environment corresponding to his destiny. We may deal in the same way with another assumption. Let us again accept as correct the assertion of occult science that the fruits of a past life are incorporated in man's spiritual germ, and that the spirit land in which man finds himself, between death and a new life, is the region in which these fruits ripen and are transformed into talents and capabilities which will appear in a new life and will form the personality so that it appears as the effect of what was gained in a former life. It will become evident to anyone who accepts these hypotheses and, bearing them in mind, surveys life impartially, that while, by their means, all material facts may be appreciated in their full truth and significance, at the same time everything becomes intelligible which, if only material facts were relied upon, must forever remain incomprehensible to one whose attention is turned toward the spiritual world. And more important still, that illogical reasoning of the kind indicated above will disappear, namely, that because the most distinguished name in a line of descent stands at the end of it, its bearer must have inherited his gifts. Life becomes logically comprehensible through the supersensual facts ascertained by occult science. Yet another weighty objection may be raised by the conscientious seeker after truth who desires to find his way to facts and has no experience of his own in the supersensual world. It may be urged that it is inadmissible to accept the existence of facts of any kind, simply because by means of them something may be explained which is otherwise unintelligible. Such an objection is meaningless to one who knows the corresponding facts from supersensual experience, and in later chapters of this book the path will be indicated that may be followed in order to gain knowledge not only of the spiritual facts herein described, but also of the law of spiritual causation as a personal experience. Anyone, however, who is not willing to enter upon this path may find the above objection important. And what can be said against it is also of value to one who is resolved to follow the path indicated. For if it is received in the right spirit, it is the very best preliminary step that can be taken on this path. It is perfectly true that one ought not to accept a statement about which one is otherwise ignorant merely because, by means of it, something otherwise inexplicable can be explained, but in the case of alleged spiritual facts the matter is different. If such statements are accepted, the intellectual consequence is not only that, by their means, life becomes intelligible, but that through admitting these hypotheses into the thought world, experiences of quite a new kind are induced. Take the following case. Something befalls a man which causes him extremely painful sensations. He may meet the situation in one of two ways. He may submit to the occurrence as something affecting him painfully and abandon himself to the painful sensation, even becoming absorbed in his grief. Or he may meet it in another way. He may say, "It is really I myself who in a former life set the force in motion which has brought me into contact with this thing. I have really brought it on myself." He may then awaken in himself all the feelings which such a thought brings in its train. It goes without saying that the thought must be entertained with perfect seriousness and with the utmost possible force if it is to have such consequences in the life of sensation and feeling. One who succeeds in this will meet with an experience which may be best illustrated by a comparison. Let us suppose that two men have each a stick of sealing wax in his hand. One begins reflecting upon its inner nature. These reflections may perhaps be very wise, but if the inner nature did not show itself in any way, someone might easily retort, "That is all imagination." The other, however, rubs the sealing wax with a woolen rag, and then shows that it attracts small particles. There is an important difference between the thoughts which have passed through the first man's head and his reflections, and those of the second. The thoughts of the first man had no actual result. Those of the second have called out a hidden force, consequently something real. The same thing happens with regard to the thoughts of a man in whose mind the idea arises that in a former life he has set going within himself the force which causes him to experience a certain event. The mere conception of this stirs up strength within him, which enables him to face the event in quite a different manner from that in which he would have met it without entertaining such an idea. It dawns upon him that an event which he would otherwise have looked upon as an accident was really a necessity, and he will immediately see that he had the right thought, because this thought had the power to reveal the facts to him. If such inner processes are repeated, they will grow into a source of inner power, and thus prove their truth by their fruitfulness. And little by little, this truth is found to be powerfully effective. Such processes have a salutary effect on body, soul, and spirit. Nay, they help life forward in every way. Man becomes aware that in this manner he takes the right position with regard to life's continuity. Whereas, by taking into consideration only the one life between birth and death, he is the victim of a delusion. Such an entirely inner proof of spiritual causation can, of course, be acquired only by each one for himself in his own inner life. But it is in everyone's power to have it. Those who have not acquired it certainly cannot judge of its convincing force. But those who have acquired it can scarcely entertain any further doubt in the matter. And there is no reason for surprise that this should be so. It is only natural that what is so wholly bound up with the constitution of man's inmost being and personality can be adequately proven only by inner experience. On the other hand, it cannot be alleged that because such a matter corresponds to inner experience, it must therefore be settled by everyone for himself, and that it is no subject for occult science. It is certain that everyone must undergo the experience for himself, just as each must see for himself the proof of a mathematical problem. But the path by which such an experience may be gained is open to all, just as the method of proving a mathematical problem is available to everyone. It ought not to be denied, apart from clairvoyant observation, of course, that by means of the force producing power of the corresponding thoughts, the just-cited proof is the only one which stands firm before all unprejudiced logic. All other considerations are no doubt very important, but in all of them there will be something on which an opponent may seize as a point of attack. Surely one who has acquired a fairly impartial way of looking at things will find something in the possibility and actual fact of man's education which has the power of logical proof that a spiritual being is struggling for existence within the sheath of the body. He will compare animals with man and say to himself that at the birth of the former there appears certain definite qualities and capacities as something decisive in itself, which plainly shows how it has been designed by heredity and how it will unfold itself in the outer world. We see how a young chicken carries out life's functions in the appointed way from its birth. But by means of education, something comes into touch with man's inner life, which is independent of any connection with his heredity, and he may be in a position to assimilate the effects of such external influences. The educator knows that such influences are met by forces coming from man's inner nature. If this is not the case, all instruction and training are meaningless. The unprejudiced educator finds the boundary line between inherited talents and those inner forces of the man himself which shine through them and originate in former lives to be very sharply marked. It is true, we cannot bring forward such weighty proofs for things of this kind as we can for certain physical facts by means of scales. But then these are just the intimate things of life, and one who has the power to appreciate such impalpable proofs will find them convincing, even more convincing than palpable reality. That animals may be trained, and thus, to a certain extent, acquire qualities and capacities by education, is no objection to one who is able to see reality, for apart from the fact that transitional stages are met with all over the world, the results of training an animal by no means fade away with its individual existence, as is the case with a man. What is more, the fact has been emphasized that faculties acquired by domestic animals through intercourse with man are transmitted, that is to say, continue in the species, not in the individual. Darwin describes how dogs fetch and carry without having been taught to do so, or without having seen it done. Who would make such an assertion with regard to human education? Now, there are thinkers whose observations have led them beyond the opinion that a man is built by purely inherited forces from without. They rise to the thought that a spiritual being, an individuality, exists before life in the body and fashions it. But many of them find it impossible to conceive that there are repeated earthly lives, and that the fruits of former lives are molding forces during the intermediate state between two lives. Let us take one instance from among the ranks of these thinkers. Emanuel Hermann Fichte, son of the great Fichte, in his Anthropology, gives the observations which led him to the following conclusion. Parents are not generators in the full sense of the word. They supply organic substance, and not alone this, but also that intermediate element of mental and sense nature which appears in temperament, coloring of character, definite tendencies, and so on, the common source of which proves to be imagination in the wider sense indicated by us. In all these elements of personality, the mingling and particular combination of the souls of the parents is unmistakable. It is therefore a perfectly well-grounded assertion that this combination is simply the result of procreation, even if we regard procreation, as we must do, as really a soul process. But the real ultimate center of the personality is just what is lacking here. For a deeper and more searching observation reveals the fact that even those peculiarities of disposition are but a covering and an instrument for the containing of the individual's really spiritual and ideal capabilities, and are qualified to aid these in their development or to hinder them, but in no wise able to originate them. It is further stated in the same work, every individual pre-exists as regards the fundamental form of his spirit, for no individual, from a spiritual point of view, resembles another, just as no species of animal resembles another species. End quote. These thoughts reach only far enough to allow a spiritual being to come into the human body. But as the forces shaping such a being are not derived from causes existing in former lives, it would be necessary that, each time a fresh personality appears, a spiritual being should come forth from a divine first cause. With this hypothesis, there would be no possibility of explaining the relationship which certainly exists between the potentialities struggling out of man's innermost being and that which is forcing its way thither from his external earthly environment during life. Man's innermost being, issuing in the case of each single person from a divine first cause, would find what confronts him in earthly life quite strange and foreign. Only then would this not be the case, as, in fact, it is not, if there had already been a connection between the inner man and the outer world, and if the inner man were not living in it for the first time. The unprejudiced educator may undoubtedly observe clearly that he impresses the consciousness of his pupil with something taken from life's experiences which in itself is foreign to his merely inherited qualities, but which, however, appears to him as if the work out of which these experiences arise had been done by him in the past. Only repeated lives on earth, in conjunction with the facts set forth by occult science as taking place in spiritual regions between two earthly lives, only this view can afford a satisfactory explanation of present human life looked at from every side. I say expressly present human life, for occult investigation shows that the cycle of earthly life certainly had a beginning, and at that time man's spiritual being, which later entered a bodily frame, existed under different conditions. In the following chapter, we shall go back to this primeval condition of human existence. When it has been shown, from the reports of occult science, how human beings received their present form in connection with the evolution of the earth, it will also be possible to indicate more precisely how the spiritual germ of man's being descends from superphysical worlds into a bodily form, and how the spiritual law of causation, or human destiny, is developed. We've reached the close of Chapter 3, where Steiner illuminates death's transformative fire, burning away desires tied to the senses and freeing the higher spirit self for its cosmic journey. These teachings bridge sleep's renewal with death's purification, showing life's rhythm as preparation for supersensible worlds. Join us next for Chapter 4. Please subscribe, like, and reflect. How does confronting death reshape your view of waking life?